Hi everyone and welcome to the channel. James here from Poseidon Miniature Painting. This is it, we finally made it to YouTube. We've been wanting to do this for a long time and now I finally have time to make some videos. Today we're going to be painting the Redemptor Dreadnought in the colour scheme of the Black Templars. Now this scheme you can use on any models in the range and we used it across an entire army commission. This is based on box art colour scheme but using some quicker techniques to make it more effective and make a great looking force on the tabletop. So let's get into the video. Okay, let's dive into this Redemptor Dreadnought. I quite like to use the art off the instruction book. There's some quite nice references on there for where we're going to place some of the brighter colours. As you can see, we've already rolled it out across the intercessors in the army, and it's just going to be the same thing but on a bigger scale. So the model has been prepped and cleaned and broken into sub-assemblies, and we have primed in black. So for the first thing we're going to work on here is the black armour itself. I'm going to be using Dark Reaper and Thunderhawk blue. Initially this is through the airbrush, and I'm just going to start with the Dark Reaper and pick out some areas of the armour panelling to give it some light source. Just be careful not to go too heavy with this. You don't want the armour to read as blue. We still want to make sure it looks black when we are finished. At the same time, as we apply this through the airbrush, it will dry darker. It's thinned as well, so as you can see, I'm just kind of picking out the edges and some areas of interest really. Just build this up and take your time. Make sure you let each layer dry before you go again, otherwise you might get some staining and running effects with the paint. Now obviously, as you can see, this technique is pretty easy through an airbrush. If you don't have one, you can use a makeup sponge, and we're going to dab gently the Dark Reaper onto the armour. Again, just trying to catch a smaller area and leave the shadows, and then just build it up slowly over time, and then we're going to go with a smaller area with each colour. Again, you could always go with the box art style where you go with a thicker edge highlight with the Dark Reaper and then work your way down with the other colours. I just think this is a super effective way and looks great across an entire army, and then when we go in with the brush and add the final highlights, it really makes it pop. I'm just going to carry on the same technique all the way across the model. I'm going to go a little bit lighter on the legs just because they would catch a little bit less light than the main torso and shoulders. Plus, I would quite like the eye to be drawn to the top half of the model where most of the points of interest are going to be. So you can see there we've got the initial highlight down. Next I'm going to come in and do the same process with Thunderhawk blue but hitting a smaller area. You'll see when this goes on the model it looks really bright, so don't worry about that too much. This is going to dull down later on, and when we start adding details and everything like that, it's really going to draw the eye away from it. So we can push this a little bit brighter than we think we need, and then when all the other details are painted in, it's going to make a little bit more sense. there you go. You can see we've now got the Dark Reaper and Thunderhawk Blue down and got a really good base for the armor colours for later on. Next thing we're going to do is the shoulder pads. So these are going to be white. We're actually going to use ivory. Again, it doesn't look that close to white when you see it in the bottle, but actually once it goes on the model, you probably don't want cold white. It's a bit stark, to be honest. So I'm just going to use some masking tape here because I want to keep the sides of the shoulder pads black and just have that front face in ivory. So I'm just going to mask it off, and then we're going to airbrush a couple of thin layers of ivory until we've got some good coverage over both of these shoulder pads. And time for the moment of truth. It's always satisfying peeling the masking tape off. As you can see, we've got a nice crisp line between the ivory and black. Again, worst case, it's easy enough to touch this up with a brush. Just make sure you use thin paint to go in there. Next up, I'm going to grab some Vallejo gloss varnish, and I'm going to cover the shoulder pads here with a couple of thin coats through the airbrush. And this is going to be before we put some transfers on. If you go with a layer of gloss varnish first, it gives you a nice smooth surface, so the transfer will sit really straight or really flat. As you can see here, the front panel on the Dreadnought, we want to mimic the Space Marine we showed at the start, so we're going to have this panel red with the white or ivory diagonal stripe across it. So I'm just going to freehand this in. I don't need to be too neat here really, because I'm going to cut it in neater with the red later on. So I've just thinned my ivory to make sure it's really thin, and I'm going to go with a few thin layers. Just make sure you let each layer dry in between. If you get impatient to try and get that coverage and start whacking loads of paint on, you're going to drag the old layer up before it's dry, and you're going to create bumps and lumps and texture on the paint. So let each layer dry, use a hairdryer if you want, nice and thin, drag the paint in one direction and repeat the process until you've got the coverage that you're happy with. Okay, time to tackle the transfer. So we've got that layer of gloss varnish over the shoulder pads, and as you can see, I've popped them in my little dish. This is brilliant, and it was actually from Christmas. I think it had like a baked camembert or something in there. So yeah, I use this every time I do transfers. Love it. So I've just popped them in a little bit of water to soak, and then using the brush, I've applied a thin layer of micro set to the shoulder pad. I'm then going to just gently shake off the excess water and move the transfer onto the shoulder pad. Don't worry too much about centering it, we've got plenty of time to move it around. I'm just going to pop these on and then get them into position. So if you've never used micro set and micro sol before for your transfers, I would recommend picking them up. They're pretty cheap and last for ages. So the micro set basically softens the transfer and helps it stick onto the model, and then we use the micro sol and that helps it to bend to the shape. Again, we don't really need it here because it's a flat shoulder pad, but if you've got an awkward shape, it's well worth soaking it and just repeat the process. It makes the membrane of the transfer thinner, so you can really bend it into shape without getting creases and things there. As you can see, I quite like to use a super sharp knife just to gently nudge it into position without cutting into the transfer itself, and get them nice and centered on that shoulder pad. So once I've got it into position and removed a good amount of the moisture with a brush, I always like to go in here with a big soft dry brush. This is great for sort of pulling the transfer down against the model, and it wicks away any of that moisture that's left without moving it. Sometimes if you try and dab it with a tissue or a brush or something like that, you're going to crinkle it or move the transfer. So you can actually start nice and gentle and then press pretty hard with this. Start from the middle, pull into the outsides. It'll stretch the transfer nice and thin, pull away all the moisture, and give you a really nice finish. So just repeat this process for any transfers you want on the model. As you can see, I've tried to mimic the Assault Intercessor, so we've used that nice chain transfer across the white stripe and then added just a couple more to the model. Again, as long as it's central on that white stripe, don't worry about the edges, we're going to neaten that up with the red later. So next thing I'm going to do now is just painting the metallics. This is a little bit of a time-consuming process, and it's well worth making sure that you are neat with it. We don't want to touch any of that nice black armor that we've got those lovely airbrush blends on. So I'm just going to take my time and work through it. Absolute worst case scenario, if you do end up with a big splodge of silver over the black armor, best thing to do really is flood it with water and then wick it away as much as you can to try and wash away those metallic flakes. If you are still struggling after that, then you might have to go in by brush with Dark Reaper, Thunderhawk and Black and just try and cover it over. Or if you absolutely hate it, you can go back in with the airbrush and repeat the process. For any of the details that are going to be gold on this model, I'm going to base coat them with Decayed Metal. I absolutely love this as a base coat for metallics. It's really dark, so you can highlight up easily. It gives great coverage, and yeah, it's just an all-round high-end paint, so would definitely recommend this. Again, if you've got your favorite gold paints, yeah, just pick out these details in gold and give them a nice smooth coat. So I'm just going to pick out the details here around the chest plate and the Aquila. Again, the actual wings themselves are going to be ivory bone colour, so I'm just going to pick out anything that looks cool, sort of personal preference, or you can refer back to the box art or the instruction manual book if you are unsure of the elements to paint metallic. Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the video so far. I'm just jumping on to offer you a free basing video. So this is our cheat code basing in the Mars scheme, but you could use any scheme that would suit your army. It's just a really quick and effective way to get your models on the tabletop if you're struggling with making the bases look good. So if you would like a copy of this, just head to the link in the description and we will send it across. So as you can see, with the transfers, metallics and that little bit of ivory, he's starting to look pretty good, to be honest. Like, you could pop him on the tabletop now and game with him and he would look pretty good. As you can see from our Assault Intercessor though, he does need some red details to really make him pop. We've stuck him on his base as well. We can cover the base in a future video. So if you really want to know how we did this, pop it in the comments and we can send you the recipe. So before we move on to the red, we're just going to finish off the black armor and really push it a little bit further. So firstly, I'm going to go in with our Thunderhawk blue and edge highlight all the armor. So I'm just going to use the side of the brush rather than the point and just run it around all those edges, trying to pick it out. You don't have to be too gentle here, we can pick it up nice and thick, because again we're going to push the highlight with Finalizing grey on another pass, so to pick out any more prominent details. So nice and easy, load your brush. I like to wick it off on my thumb just to make sure there's no big runoff of paint onto the model, and then just shoot around the edges, really nice and easy. So there are a few slightly trickier elements, depending how confident you are with your brush control, around some of the panels that we're going to need to use the point of the brush. So we can't get the side in to just drag it along. So we're going to just load up the brush the same, wick away a lot of the paint onto your thumb or a piece of kitchen roll or something, and then just take your time, nice and easy, try and paint those straight lines. It's mainly around the indents on the panels and some of the details there, really. If you feel like you really don't want to do it, you could skip this step and just go with the main panels and it would still look great. So I've now moved on to the Finalizing grey here. So just be careful with this, because we don't want to go crazy with the highlighting and make it too bright. I'm just going to pick out the rivets, a few of those highlight areas at the top of the model that would catch the most light. And then you've probably noticed on top of that shoulder panel, I have done some scratching and just sort of pulled the brush across effects. I quite like to do a little bit of scratching and battle damage, just gently with the edge highlight, just to break up some of those larger panels. I'm kind of just moving now between the two colours, depending where I am on the model and depending how bright I want certain elements to look. So you can just take your time here really with these two colours, work your way round, and you can always adjust back down if you go a little bit too bright. This is it for the black armor itself, so not too bad really, just the airbrush highlight and then following up with the brush, and it gives us a really strong effect across the army. Okay, so with that, the black armor is complete, and we're now going to add those red details. This is a brilliant stage of the model because it really makes it pop. So I'm just going to trace in those lines on the chest plate and take my time and get a nice crisp edge to the ivory. Here I'm using chrome red, so once I've got that in, I'm just going to fill in the rest of the panel. Again, my paint is watered down here and I'm not expecting full coverage on the first layer. I'm more interested in making sure the paint is nice and smooth, let it dry and then apply a second layer. So if you really struggle with this part of painting and getting a nice crisp line and you're worried you're going to mess it up, just take your time, make sure you haven't got too much paint on the brush. Once you get that point in position, then you can sort of lie the brush flat and pull it towards you and just drag it along the line basically. Take your time, you don't have to rush this. We're more concerned with making sure it's nice and crisp. And as you can see, we've added a red panel to the knee. Again, we haven't got full coverage here. We're going to build this up over a few layers to keep the paint nice and smooth. So we've got the corn red down, and our first highlight colour for the red is going to be Mephiston red. So this is similar to how you would do the black armour if you didn't have an airbrush. I'm going to highlight most of the red, but make sure I leave the centre area or the shadowy areas in the corn red. I'm going to build this up over a few thin glazes just to try and smoothen out the transitions between the two colours. And then I'm just going to repeat this on the other side of the shoulder and on the top half of the knee pad. So I'm just going to repeat the process and then we're going to move on to Evil Sun's Scarlet and carry on same again in a smaller area. The main tip here really is to make sure you keep to the edges. Think of this as a chunky edge highlight, but also the direction of the brush strokes. So what we don't want to do here is leave any water staining of the lighter colour in the shadows that we've just created and ruin the transition. So as you can see here, I'm going to start from the inside and pull the brush to the outside. Reason being, when we lift that brush off the model, it's going to leave a really small pool of paint, or like a puddle if you will, and we want that in the brightest area so we can't see it as water staining. If you kind of drag it to the middle or to the darker area, it's going to ruin that transition and ruin the effect we're building up. Okay, our red is almost complete. We're just going to give it a little edge highlight to really make it pop. So I've now got Wild Rider Red on the palette. Again, just wick it off on your thumb and use the side of the brush and just give it a nice crisp edge highlight. I'm also going to just add a few gentle scratch lines to keep it in keeping with the black armour, as we did this with the Dark Reaper. So again, just use the point of the brush, start in the darkest part and drag the paint towards the lightest part, so it'll give us a nice scratch without pooling any paint. And just repeat the same process on the knee pad. Okay, so I'm happy with the red armour. It's looking really nice against the black. I did decide, however, at this point I wanted to quarter panel the knee pad and add some ivory in there. Again, if you've got to this point and you're happy, you can leave it there, but I'm just going to divide the black area and paint a quarter of it in the ivory. So again, this is the same as we did earlier on, nice and thin paint with the ivory. We just need to be a little bit neater here because we don't want to have to touch up the black or the red, but super thin layers. We're not going to get good coverage initially. The main focus is making sure your paint is nice and thin and that you get smooth coverage. So as you can see, we've built up the layers. I think this was 3 coats of ivory to get a nice solid finish. And then I'm just going to go back and add a couple of decals. So we've got the reverse chain, which is the white, and then the little Black Templars cross. So it really makes it pop just adding those extra details to the model. So I've basically just followed the exact same steps but on the weapons. So the plasma casing has got a little bit of a different shape to it. The sort of corner lugs are going to catch the light, so the brightest areas are going to be at the top and then on the sides that are prominent, with the shadows and the dark corn red sort of sitting somewhere in the middle in that dark recess. But as you can see, it really is effective once you get this across the weapon casing itself. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the bone details. So I'm going to use Zandri dust, a Shapti bone and ivory. So initially I'm going to go in with the Zandri dust, nice smooth coats, I know I keep saying it, and then I'm just going to block in any of the details. So as I said earlier, the wings on the Aquila on the front of the Dreadnought are going to have a nice bone highlight. So we're just going to get this nice and smooth layers of Zandri dust. Takes a couple of layers just to build up that coverage, and then we're going to start highlighting up. I quite like the idea of having this guy as just a bigger version of the Assault Intercessor, so I keep referring back just to make sure I haven't missed any details. But you can see there the effect we're looking for on this chest piece. So next up I'm going to come in with a Shapti bone, and I'm going to pick out the top layers and the top edges, and then on each of the individual feathers of the wings I'm going to make sure I leave Zandri dust in the darkest recesses. I'm going to thin this paint down, and then as we did before, we're going to glaze starting from the middle and then pull it out towards the end of the wingtip. Okay, so once we've got good coverage there, I'm then going to go in with our ivory. So we've used this as the white shoulder pads, but it's actually got a little bit more of like a yellow hue to it. So again, we're just going to pick up the most extreme highlights of the wings, so just the very tips, again pulling to the outer edge so we don't leave that puddling or pooling of the paint, and then just the top edge highlight of the wings themselves, just to really make it stand out. And there we have it, the wings and the ivory effects are complete. Nice and simple, but again, really makes it pop on the model itself. Okay, next thing we're going to move on to is highlighting our metallics. It's always worth making sure you have 2 cups or water containers, one for using your normal paints and one for metallics. You don't want to be using metallics on the brush and in the water and then moving on to things like ivory, because you're going to get little speckles of metallic through that paint. So try and have a fresh water container. Here I'm going to use Dwarven Gold, and I'm just going to stipple and pick out and highlight the extreme areas of the gold. Again, we've got that decayed metal that gives us a really nice dark shadow colour, so we're just going to pick out some of the prominent features and give the sharp edges a nice edge highlight. And to highlight any of the silver, I'm just going to use Vallejo steel. So again, I'm not going to edge highlight everything that's metallic. I'm just going to pick out any features that are prominent, the muzzles on the bolters and the tops of the exhausts. For any part of the actual chassis that we can see underneath, I'm just going to get a small dry brush in there. Again, scrub the paint off on a piece of kitchen roll so there's very little residue left on the brush, and then I'm just going to cast it over the frame underneath just to give it a little bit of highlight without having to edge highlight every detail of the metallics. So with the metallic silvers dry brush with steel, that is our model complete. The only other thing left to do is the plasma effects. This is going to be covered in a future video because we are going to cover how to achieve these results with an airbrush and also by hand with a paintbrush. Thanks very much for watching the video, guys. Please consider liking and subscribing to see more of our content in the future. We hope you enjoyed the video and we will see you on the next one.